The most dangerous American spies of World War II didn't carry guns. They carried handbags. The story of America's wars has usually been told through the voices of men, generals leaning over maps, soldiers charging through smoke, presidents speaking from polished desks. Yet behind those familiar images existed another army, one that left almost no photographs and very few names on monuments. They were women who learned to disappear in plain sight. They carried messages in the hems of dresses, memorized railway schedules the way others memorized prayers, and learned to smile at men they secretly intended to destroy. In the early years of the 20th century, the United States did not officially believe women were suited for intelligence work. The government files of the period are filled with confident statements that espionage required a masculine temperament. But wars have a way of humiliating confident theories. When American soldiers began arriving in Europe during the First World War, they discovered that the most valuable information was not coming from uniformed scouts, but from women who worked as typists, nurses, switchboard operators, and maids inside buildings men could never enter without suspicion. One of the earliest recruits was a quiet schoolteacher from Ohio who had crossed the Atlantic simply to volunteer as a translator. She spoke French with a soft rural accent and had the kind of face that invited confessions. The American officers in Paris noticed that German diplomats seemed unusually comfortable talking around her. She listened, remembered, and wrote nothing down. Her reports were delivered verbally in borrowed apartments where the curtains were always half closed. Long after the war ended, an intelligence officer admitted that several Allied bombing decisions had been based entirely on what she overheard while pretending to grade children's homework. By the time the Second World War arrived, Washington had learned its lesson, though it would never fully admit it. The Office of Strategic Services, the organization that later became the CIA, began recruiting women in numbers never before imagined. Officially, they were secretaries and file clerks. Unofficially, they were code breakers, couriers, and field agents. Training manuals warned them that if captured, they would not be treated as soldiers. Many signed the papers anyway. One recruit remembered the smell of the training rooms more clearly than the lessons. They practiced picking locks in basements that smelled of oil and damp cement. They learned how to write with invisible ink made from common medicines. They were taught to observe a stranger the way a doctor studies an X-ray, shoes first, then hands, then the nervous habits around the mouth. The instructors rarely praised them. "Your advantage," one officer said, "is that the enemy will underestimate you. Do not ruin that gift." In New York Harbor, passenger liners leaving for Lisbon and Casablanca carried more than refugees and businessmen. Among them were American women traveling under names that would exist only for a few months. A former journalist sailed as the widowed wife of a Canadian engineer. A Texas musician became the private tutor to a fictional family. Their luggage contained ordinary dresses bought from department stores, but inside the linings were microfilmed maps and lists of contacts written in codes that looked like shopping notes. Europe in those years was a continent of locked doors, and women were often the only keys that fit. In occupied France, German officers relaxed their guard in cafes where young waitresses moved between tables. An American agent working under Red Cross cover spent evenings pouring wine for men who discussed troop movements as casually as weather. She later wrote that the hardest part was pretending not to understand the importance of what she heard. "Excitement makes people memorable," her handler had warned. "Memory gets people killed." Communication was the constant problem. Radios were heavy and dangerous, and couriers were hunted relentlessly. Some of the most effective methods now sound almost childish. Messages were hidden inside knitting patterns, inside recipes for apple pies, inside the lyrics of popular songs. One network passed information through a traveling cosmetics saleswoman who carried tiny rolls of film in lipstick tubes. The Gestapo searched her suitcase twice and complained only about the poor quality of American face powder. Back in Washington, the women who never left the country fought a different war. In crowded rooms filled with the clatter of typewriters, they broke enemy codes that changed every few days. Mathematicians from women's colleges worked beside debutantes who had been recruited because they could keep secrets better than their brothers. They lived in boarding houses where conversation about work was forbidden, even with roommates employed by the same agency. Many went through the entire war without being able to tell their families what they did for a living. One night in 1943, a group of these code breakers intercepted a transmission that revealed the location of a German submarine pack stalking the Atlantic coast. The information reached the Navy in time to divert a convoy carrying thousands of American soldiers. No medals were awarded to the women who translated the message. The official report credited routine intelligence procedures. Decades later, when the files were finally opened, most of their names had already faded from public memory. The field agents faced dangers that left no room for modesty. They learned to change appearance the way actors change costumes. Hair dyed darker or lighter, shoes scuffed to look older, wedding rings worn to discourage attention or removed to invite it, depending on the mission. They carried pills meant to end their lives quickly if captured, though few spoke about that part of the training afterward. What they remembered instead were the small human details. The French farmer who insisted on giving an agent his only chicken, the Dutch child who kept a lookout while a radio operator transmitted from a hayloft. Not every mission succeeded. Some women vanished into prisons whose names were whispered like diseases. A young courier arrested near Lyon refused to betray her contacts even after weeks of interrogation. The Germans listed her simply as American female, occupation unknown. She died before the liberation, and for years her family believed she had been working safely as a nurse. Stories like hers rarely appeared in newspapers, partly because the government wished to protect secrets, and partly because the public preferred heroes in uniform. Yet there were triumphs as well, quiet victories that never made headlines. An agent in Rome persuaded an Italian railway clerk to delay a train carrying ammunition, giving Allied bombers a clear target. In Belgium, a former librarian organized a network that guided downed American pilots across the border using children as messengers. Each success depended on patience rather than gunfire, on the ability to live ordinary lives while performing extraordinary tasks. The men who commanded these operations often admitted, in private memos, that women possessed advantages impossible to reproduce in male agents. They moved through markets and kitchens without attracting notice. They could ask naive questions and receive honest answers. Even their mistakes were interpreted as harmless. But the same officers worried about public reaction if the truth became widely known. The nation, they believed, was not ready to imagine its daughters as professional deceivers. When victory finally arrived in 1945, the hidden army was quietly dismantled. Women were thanked for their service and encouraged to return to normal lives. Many married, raised children, and learned to speak about the war only in the vaguest terms. The files containing their real identities were locked away under classifications that lasted longer than some of their marriages. America celebrated its generals and its factories, while the women who had listened at doors and memorized secrets tried to forget the sound of their own cautious footsteps. But history has a stubborn memory. Every few years another box is opened, another code name connected to a real person. Another family discovers that the gentle grandmother who baked cookies had once carried a pistol in her handbag. Their stories do not resemble the glamorous tales invented by movies. They are quieter, filled with waiting and fear and the constant effort to appear ordinary. That ordinariness was precisely what saved America, though the nation took a long time to understand it. The war taught the United States many new languages, but the most difficult one was silence. Women who entered the intelligence world discovered that secrecy was not a single rule but a way of breathing. They learned to answer questions from neighbors without answering anything at all. They learned to write cheerful letters home while living under names that were not theirs. One agent later compared it to walking on ice that might break at any moment. You smiled so no one would notice the cracks. London, where American and British services worked side by side, the days were filled with fog and paperwork. A former librarian from Massachusetts spent her mornings cataloging captured German documents and her evenings memorizing the faces of men she was supposed to meet only once. She was taught to recognize fear in others because she was forbidden to show it herself. Her handler told her that courage in espionage did not mean the absence of terror, only the ability to carry it politely. The city was crowded with uniforms, but the women who mattered most rarely wore any. They arrived at offices carrying lunch bags and left carrying secrets. Some worked as translators, turning intercepted letters into careful English while searching for hidden meanings between ordinary sentences. Others posed as telephone operators, connecting calls they were meant to overhear. A single misplaced word could lead bombers to the wrong factory or send resistance fighters into a trap. One of the earliest networks run almost entirely by women operated out of a small dress shop near Piccadilly. To any passerby, it was a struggling business selling sensible coats to secretaries. In the back room, however, maps covered the walls and a radio set was hidden beneath a pile of fabric. Couriers arrived pretending to shop for gloves. The owner, an American who had once dreamed of becoming a fashion designer, kept a notebook of measurements that were actually coordinates of bridges and fuel depots. Across the Atlantic, families wondered why their daughters suddenly wrote from unfamiliar addresses. The government allowed only the vaguest explanations. Parents were told that the girls were helping with administrative duties. Few imagined that administrative duties could include parachute training. Yet several American women were dropped into occupied territory with nothing but forged papers and brief instructions. They landed at night, listening to dogs barking in villages they could not see. Life in the field was a constant theater performance. An agent in Marseille pretended to be the bored wife of a traveling salesman and spent her days queuing for bread like everyone else. She counted German trucks the way other women counted ration coupons. When soldiers flirted with her, she practiced laughing at the right volume. The resistance fighters who depended on her information knew her only by a single initial written on scraps of paper. Trust was the rarest currency. The Gestapo specialized in turning neighbors into witnesses, and many networks collapsed because someone believed the wrong story. Women agents were warned never to become too fond of the people who sheltered them. Affection created habits, and habits created patterns that enemy surveillance could recognize. Still, human nature resisted instruction. More than one operation was saved because an agent risked everything for a family that had shown her simple kindness. Inside the United States, the work was less dramatic, but no less exhausting. In Washington's temporary wooden buildings, rows of women bent over machines that looked like complicated typewriters. They tested combinations of letters for hours, chasing the logic of enemy codes that changed as often as the weather. The room smelled of coffee and carbon paper. Supervisors timed bathroom breaks because a single delay might mean missing a message from a ship under attack. A young mathematician from Chicago discovered a pattern in Japanese naval signals while listening to the radio in her boarding house. She carried the idea to her superiors the next morning, certain they would dismiss it. Instead, they built an entire decoding system around her insight. The system later helped locate an enemy fleet in the Pacific. Official communiques praised innovative analytical methods, leaving the inventor anonymous behind a wall of classification stamps. The emotional cost of such work rarely appeared in reports. Many women lived for years without being able to explain their absences to friends. Relationships ended because they could not say where they had been or why they were afraid of simple questions. One agent returned from Europe and discovered that her fiancé had married someone else. He assumed she had lost interest during her mysterious government job. She congratulated him politely and never corrected the misunderstanding. Training schools multiplied as the war grew wider. In quiet American towns, groups of women practiced Morse code until the sound followed them into dreams. They learned to jump from moving trains and to recognize explosives by smell. Instructors emphasized ordinary skills: how to remember a face after seeing it for 3 seconds, how to invent a believable childhood on short notice. The most difficult lesson was how to betray convincingly if ordered to do so. Not all the recruits were young. Some were mothers whose children believed they were taking clerical jobs. A widow from Georgia became one of the best radio operators in the European theater, transmitting from attics while her teenage son thought she was working for a shipping company. She kept his photograph beside the transmitter and turned it face down whenever the Germans began direction-finding searches. The enemy gradually realized that many of its problems had feminine handwriting. German counterintelligence files began to mention American ladies with increasing irritation. Yet prejudice worked in the agent's favor. Officers found it difficult to imagine that the woman selling flowers outside headquarters might be knotting the license numbers of staff cars. Arrogance, like alcohol, made men careless. In Italy, a network led by an American social worker arranged escapes for prisoners of war. She negotiated with priests, smugglers, and occasionally corrupt officials, paying each with different currencies of gratitude. The operation saved hundreds of soldiers who later believed their rescue had been organized by mysterious local patriots. Only decades afterward did some learn that the chain had been coordinated from a cramped apartment by a woman who disliked carrying weapons because they ruined the line of her coat. The closer the Allies came to victory, the more dangerous the work became. Desperate regimes grow suspicious of everyone. Agents were instructed to burn their belongings and prepare to vanish if compromised. A courier captured near the Swiss border swallowed a strip of film to prevent its discovery, and survived only because a sympathetic doctor pretended not to notice. She spent the rest of her life unable to look at hospitals without trembling. Yet amid the tension there were moments of ordinary beauty. One spy remembered hearing church bells in a liberated town and realizing she had not noticed music for 2 years. Another wrote about watching snow fall on the roofs of Paris while waiting for a contact who never arrived. These small memories outlived the grand strategies that had brought them to Europe in the first place. When military historians later searched for clear turning points, they struggled to measure the value of such invisible labor. How does one calculate the worth of a conversation overheard on a tram, or a letter delayed by a clever lie? The women themselves rarely tried. They spoke instead of friendships formed in strange places, of the relief of surviving another day without being discovered. As 1944 turned into 1945, many sensed that their secret world was already dissolving. New male officers arrived eager to claim credit, and some women were quietly replaced by men once the front lines moved east. The agents accepted it with the same discipline that had carried them through the war. They had been trained to be temporary, like passwords that must be changed. Still, on certain evenings in London and Washington, groups of them gathered in small restaurants to celebrate successes that could never be announced. They toasted with cheap wine to missions known only by code names and to friends who would not return. The waiters assumed they were ordinary office workers enjoying a night out, and in a way they were. The extraordinary part remained hidden beneath polite laughter. The conflict was drawing toward its thunderous conclusion, but for these women the end promised not triumph but erasure. Files were already being marked for storage, identities prepared for burial under decades of secrecy. They had helped save a nation that preferred not to remember how it had been saved. Yet the work continued, because until the final signature on the final surrender, someone still needed to listen, to watch, and to carry messages in the lining of an ordinary handbag. By the winter of 1944, the war had begun to feel like an enormous machine that could no longer be stopped, only guided away from the worst collisions. For the women inside America's intelligence services, the days grew longer and the instructions shorter. Experience had replaced theory. They no longer needed manuals to tell them how to behave when followed, or how to destroy a document with a single match. The knowledge lived in their muscles, in the careful way they opened doors, and in the calm expressions they practiced before mirrors. Paris, newly liberated yet still nervous, became a crossroads of secrets. American women arrived wearing borrowed coats and carrying suitcases that held more than clothing. They were sent to interview refugees streaming back from camps, to sort truth from the inventions people created in order to survive. One agent spent weeks listening to stories in a former school building, writing names on index cards while children played in the courtyard outside. She said later that the hardest part was deciding which tears were evidence. The city's cafes filled again with music, but the conversations at certain tables were measured and cautious. A stenographer from Iowa, promoted because she could type without looking at the keys, found herself taking dictation from resistance leaders who spoke too quickly and trusted too slowly. She learned to keep 3 versions of every note: the one she showed her superiors, the one she hid for safety, and the one she carried only in memory in case both papers were lost. Across Germany, the collapse produced opportunities as well as dangers. Women who had once gathered information were now asked to predict chaos. They interviewed factory managers about shortages and housewives about rumors, building portraits of cities the Allies intended to occupy. The questions sounded innocent. How often did the trams run? Which bridges were already damaged? Yet each answer could determine where soldiers would be sent and how many might live. One American agent operating near the Dutch border used a bicycle as her passport. She rode from village to village pretending to search for relatives, noting the condition of roads and the temper of local officials. When questioned by German patrols, she complained about the price of eggs and showed them photographs of imaginary cousins. The officers usually waved her on, amused by her persistence, unaware that the photographs concealed microdots smaller than grains of sand. The technology of spying was changing almost weekly. New miniature cameras arrived from laboratories, delicate as jewelry and just as expensive. Women were taught to use them while pretending to adjust stockings or powder noses. In safe houses, they practiced photographing documents in the time it took a kettle to boil. Yet the old methods remained the most reliable. A well-timed conversation, a compliment offered to the right clerk, a memory trained to notice which window lights burned late into the night. Back in Washington, the code rooms worked without holidays. The women there followed the progress of the war through fragments of intercepted messages, seeing victories before newspapers could print them and defeats that editors were ordered to soften. A group of operators celebrated Christmas by decorating a teletype machine with paper snowflakes. The next morning, they used the same machine to translate a report of a transport ship sunk in the channel, and the decorations were quietly removed. The personal lives of these women continued to shrink. Many avoided friendships because every relationship required explanations they could not provide. Boarding house landladies complained that their tenants kept irregular hours and received strange telephone calls. One agent invented a fiancé serving overseas simply to satisfy curious neighbors. She bought herself flowers on imaginary anniversaries and learned to speak fondly of a man who did not exist. Field work grew harsher as German security tightened. Dogs were trained to search for radio equipment, and entire neighborhoods were searched after a single transmission. A radio operator from California hid her set inside the hollow base of a grandfather clock and transmitted while pretending to dust the furniture. When the Gestapo finally searched the apartment, they complimented her housekeeping and apologized for the inconvenience. Not every woman could bear the pressure. Some asked to be reassigned after witnessing executions or betrayals. The services rarely blamed them. Breaking was considered a wound like any other. Yet even those who left carried the war inside them. A former courier who returned to teaching could not tolerate the sound of chalk tapping a blackboard because it reminded her of signals knocked on prison walls. Amid the darkness there were flashes of humor. Agents developed a private language of jokes about forged identities and terrible disguises. One favorite story concerned a recruit who was given papers describing her as an accomplished pianist. She could not play a single note and avoided houses with pianos for the rest of the war. Laughter, brief and cautious, became another tool for survival. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine, the mission of the female network shifted again. They were asked to locate scientists, artworks, and even recipes for industrial chemicals before rival powers could claim them. A museum assistant from Boston found herself cataloging crates of paintings hidden in salt mines, guarding them with the same determination she had once applied to decoding messages. She joked that she had traveled across an ocean to become a watchwoman for ghosts on canvas. The liberation of concentration camps confronted many agents with realities their reports had only hinted at. Women who had spent years cultivating detachment suddenly discovered its limits. One interpreter fainted while translating for survivors and apologized repeatedly as if she had committed a professional error. Her commanding officer told her gently that some things were allowed to hurt. Rumors of the coming peace spread faster than official orders. Hotels in London filled with officers planning new careers, but the women of intelligence waited without invitations. They understood that the end of the war might also be the end of their usefulness. A secretary who had run an entire courier system was informed that her position would disappear within months. She asked for a letter of recommendation and received a paragraph so vague it could have described anyone. Still, the work demanded attention until the final hour. In April 1945, a team of female analysts recognized a change in German naval codes that suggested a last-minute evacuation of officials. Their warning helped intercept several ships carrying men who intended to escape justice. The credit again belonged to anonymous signals personnel. Yet within the office, a pot of strong coffee was brewed in silent celebration. When the surrender finally came, the streets filled with noise that felt almost indecent to those accustomed to whispering. Women who had spent years pretending to be ordinary were suddenly expected to rejoice like everyone else. Some did, dancing with strangers and buying drinks they could not afford. Others watched from windows, uncertain how to return to a world that knew nothing of the one they had inhabited. Orders arrived instructing them to gather files, remove photographs, and prepare for declassification that might take decades. Code names were struck through with heavy pencils. Addresses were replaced by blank spaces. An agent who had crossed half of Europe using 6 different identities watched clerks reduce her to a single folder thinner than a magazine. She wondered which version of herself would survive. Trains carried many of them home across an ocean suddenly peaceful. They traveled with veterans who spoke openly about battles, while their own stories remained locked behind polite smiles. A nurse on one ship asked a group of returning women where they had served. "Offices," one replied, and the others nodded, accepting the small lie that would shape the rest of their lives. Yet the story did not end with the signing of documents. Peace created its own form of exile. The skills that had kept them alive were suddenly inconvenient. Employers wanted cheerful receptionists, not women who noticed every unguarded doorway. One former agent applied for a job at a bank and was rejected because she seemed too observant for routine work. She kept the letter for years as a private medal. Government officials debated what to do with the thousands of pages the women had produced. Some argued that the records should be destroyed to protect methods. Others believed they might be needed again in a future war already taking shape on the horizon. While the men argued, the women packed their typewriters and returned to kitchens, classrooms, and small apartments that felt strangely narrow after a world of secret borders. A few tried to speak and were gently stopped. Publishers expressed interest in memoirs until they learned how many sentences would be forbidden. Families asked questions at holiday dinners and received only careful anecdotes about food shortages and bad weather overseas. The nation was eager for uncomplicated heroes, and these women were complicated by design. Still, traces of their work began to surface in unexpected places. A rescued pilot recognized the voice of the shopkeeper, who had once guided him to safety, and wrote a grateful letter that reached the wrong address before finding the right one. A museum in Italy displayed paintings saved by an unnamed American, and visitors wondered about the identity of the quiet guardian. History, like water, found small cracks to move through. Many lived long enough to see the files finally opened. They attended ceremonies where young officers thanked them for services that sounded almost mythical. The women listened politely, amused that the government now praised the very talents it had once hidden. Some accepted medals, others preferred a simple handshake and the chance to tell a granddaughter why she still kept an old handbag locked in a drawer. Looking back, they rarely described themselves as heroes. They spoke instead of ordinary motives: the wish to be useful, the refusal to watch the world burn without trying to help, the stubborn belief that women could serve their country in more ways than anyone expected. Their victories were measured not in territory, but in lives quietly preserved. America eventually learned their names, though never all of them. Streets and buildings were dedicated, documentaries filmed, and historians argued over details that the women remembered only as fragments. Yet the essence of their contribution remained simple. In a war dominated by thunder, they had mastered the art of the whisper. They had moved through enemy cities like shadows at noon and returned with pieces of truth that helped turn the tide. The country they came home to was safer because of choices made by women who carried messages in the linings of coats and courage in places no uniform could display. Their story, once buried beneath layers of secrecy, became a reminder that history is not shaped only by those who march in the open. Sometimes it is shaped by those who walk quietly, pretending to be ordinary, while the fate of nations rests unnoticed in their hands.